Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Mandic, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. We are starting a new unit. This is the first lecture in our unit about God. And some of the things that we should be keeping in mind is the difference between the approach to God that philosophers have and the approach to God that religious people and theologians have. There's a big difference, and it's important to keep that difference in mind. One way of thinking about the way God operates in the context of philosophy, as opposed to the way God operates in discussions that are properly thought of as not philosophy, but instead are religious discussions or theological discussions, is that for philosophy, the approach to God is grounded in reason. Remember our definition of philosophy as that which can be known through reason alone about topics that are fundamental to all other knowledge and ways of living. Now, God is one of these fundamental topics, and we're trying to get to answers about God. Does God exist? If God exists or not, could that be known? Or what is the existence or lack thereof of God somehow outside of knowledge? What's the nature of God? If God did exist, would God be all good? Would an all good God allow suffering to exist? We try to get at this through reason, as opposed to assuming that there is revelation. Philosophers don't rely on, at least they don't primarily rely on, things like scripture or prophets. Maybe there are scriptures and prophets that have genuine access to a real God. But philosophers, as philosophers, aren't interested in that. Maybe they are also religious people, and as religious people, they are interested in it, and they hold certain books to be holy, and they take those writings to be holy scriptures. They hold certain individuals to be genuine prophets, and they accept their word as the word of God. Um, but that would be to take a religious approach as opposed to a philosophical approach. So one way of thinking then about what our main philosophical topics are have to do with reasons for belief in God, or reasons for thinking that maybe God couldn't exist in a universe that also had suffering in it. Or maybe God couldn't exist in a universe that also had free will in it. Okay, so here's what we have planned for this lecture. First, we're going to deal with several definitions. We're going to define theism and some of the opposites of theism. Then we're going to talk about definitions of God. There's a couple of different ways of defining God, and you get importantly different results depending on how you define God. Then we're going to switch slightly and leave the philosophy of religion and get in a little bit into the philosophy of science. We're going to talk about something called the Leibniz-Clark debate. Leibniz keeps on appearing in our lectures. He is a very important philosopher historically, has made many contributions to the philosophy of math, philosophy of religion, the philosophy of physics, and this is a little chapter from the philosophy of physics in which God shows up too. So it's the way in which religion and philosophy and science all interacted. And then we're going to be getting into arguments for the existence of God. A lot of what we discuss in these lectures about God have to do with various arguments, famous arguments that have been given for the existence of God, and also some arguments against the existence of God. And two of the most famous and important ones that we're going to look at are there's one argument that comes from Anselm and another argument that comes from Descartes, both of which are arguing for the existence of God. Okay, so let's start off by defining theism. You may have heard of theism before, and maybe are in a position right now to tell me what the definition is instead of me telling you what the definition is. And maybe you know that the way to define theism is something like it's the philosophical view or it's the belief that God exists. Now, people that aren't theists usually fall into one of two groups. Either they are atheists or they're agnostics. An atheist opposes theism by negating it. The theist says that God exists, and the atheist says that God does not exist. Now, as defined, there's nothing explicitly mentioning knowledge, but you might think that someone that said this sounds like they are claiming to know that God exists. If someone came up to you and said, "Hey, there's a rainbow out today," you would presume that they think they know that there's a rainbow out, right? Like if you ask them, "Do you know that there's a rainbow out?" and then they said, "Oh no, I have no idea." Like, well, that'd be weird. Why'd you say that in the first place? Usually, when people say something, they imply that they claim to know it. Uh, if I told you something, like I told you that school is going to be canceled tomorrow, I would be presuming to know that class is canceled tomorrow. If I had no idea whether class is going to be canceled tomorrow, I wouldn't go around telling people that it is going to be canceled tomorrow. So we've got theism is asserting the existence of God, and atheism is asserting the non-existence of God, and both of them you might interpret as making knowledge claims. It's implied that they know those things, and the agnostic is opposed to both of them. The agnostic is opposed to them because of the implicit knowledge claims. The agnostic is explicitly denying knowledge about these topics. The agnostic holds that it cannot be known whether God exists or not. Maybe God exists, according to the agnostic. Maybe God doesn't exist, according to the agnostic. Either way, you wouldn't be able to know whether God exists or not. So we've got two ways of opposing theism, the belief in the existence of God. One is to just say, no, God doesn't exist. And the other one is to say, well, maybe God does exist, but you don't know that, buddy, and neither does anyone else. So that's how to define various isms with respect to God. But how do you define the God part? Now, there's all sorts of different ways of defining God, and depending on how you define God, a belief in God is going to be more or less plausible. So if you define God as like, well, something bigger than me, well, of course that exists. There's like maybe all sorts of things that are bigger than me. The Empire State Building is bigger than me. Um, the entire continent of North America is bigger than me. So there's lots of things that are bigger than me. And if what you mean by God is something bigger than yourself, then of course that exists. But does anyone really believe that the entire continent of North America is God? Like that would be unusual for anyone to think that the entire continent of North America would have any of the other properties that you might associate with God. Like, does it deserve to be worshipped? Is the continent of North America the creator of the universe? A lot of things that would normally go along with being God seem not to be captured simply by defining God as that which is bigger. Anyway, if you look at classical philosophical discussions of the definition of God, there's a few definitions that come up again and again and again. Those are the ones that we're going to be focusing on in these lectures. But one thing for you to think about, and this might be something you end up writing a paper about, is if it were up to you to define God, if someone said, well, what's your definition of God? Maybe you're a theist, maybe you're an atheist, maybe you're an agnostic. But when you think about God, what do you mean by that word? When you say things about God, like you might say of yourself, you don't know whether God exists or not. Well, what do you mean by God? What's the thing you don't know the existence of? Is it the Eiffel Tower? That's what you're agnostic about? Is it like the mere existence of something larger, or the source of all being? Is that what you're agnostic about? If you are an atheist, you're denying the existence of something. What is it that you deny exists? Are you denying that there is something that allows for human happiness? Are you denying that there's a permanent possibility of goodness in the world? Are you denying that there's a source for all existence? That's kind of hard to deny. In a lot of those cases, it seems like there would have to be such a thing. Are you denying that there is a man with a beard who floats in the sky? And, well, I mean, maybe that's wise to deny, but maybe no serious believer in God ever really was committed to the beard thing or the sky floating. So, it's good to be precise in your definitions. And when we get into the history of philosophical debates about these definitions, there's certain definitions that come up. And maybe the one that you have in mind is very similar to those. So, what do you think of when you think of God? How would you define God? Would you come up with something like this? Because here's a classic definition from the history of philosophy, of discussions of God, that God is an infinitely perfect being, a being that has all and only perfections, and further has them to the infinite degree. So let's think about that a little bit. An infinitely perfect being. So we're not talking about just a perfect being, but an infinitely perfect being. A perfect circle, if there were such a thing as a perfect circle, that would be a perfect being. It's at least perfectly round. But there's other things that it's not perfect. It's not a perfect snack. You probably couldn't eat a circle. It's not a perfect companion. It probably wouldn't be a very good friend to you. So it's not perfect in all the ways that something could be perfect. It's just perfect in this one particular respect. A perfect circle is perfectly round. But an infinitely perfect being, what does that mean? Well, an infinitely perfect being is something that is perfect in all ways. And we can spell that out by saying, think of all the good properties. An infinitely perfect being would have all of those properties. So is it good to be wise? Is it good to have wisdom? Then an infinitely perfect being would have wisdom. And further, for any of these properties that come in degrees, so like when it comes to being merciful, you could be more or less merciful. When it comes to being wise, you could be more or less wise. Those things come in degrees. The infinitely perfect being has those good properties to the infinite degree. And we might further elaborate and say that the infinitely perfect being has no flaws. An infinitely perfect being has all the good properties and none of the bad properties. So is it bad to be impatient? Then God is not impatient. Is it bad to be wrathful? Then God is not wrathful. Now you might say, wait a minute, I think God's pretty wrathful. Well, do you think God is perfectly good? If so, then you better come up with some story about how it's actually good to be wrathful. How about being purple? Is it good to be purple, or is it bad, or is it just neutral? You might say being purple is neutral. It's like being any particular color is neutral. And so, is God purple? Not necessarily. If he wanted to be purple on it for some particular occasion, maybe he just had some purpose was served by his being purple that day. Maybe it was Halloween and he was going to dress up as a grape. I don't know. But probably it's irrelevant what color God is. And it's probably irrelevant what gender or sexual characteristics God has, even though many people will refer to God as being male. Probably that's not relevant. Um, what shape is God? Is God triangular or spherical? Probably doesn't matter. So maybe he's all of the shapes or none of the shapes. But if it's good to be intelligent, if it's good to have knowledge, if it's good to be loving and kind and merciful, then God has those properties. And if those properties come in greater or lesser degrees, then God has them to the greatest, utmost degree. That's what it means to define God in this way. Now, if you think of this definition of God, well, if there were such a thing, that would be pretty awesome. Like, if there was a being that was infinitely perfect, that had all and only the good properties and it had them to the maximum degree, well, you should probably like take that pretty seriously. Maybe even like dedicate your life to worshiping it. Maybe model it in your own behavior. Try to be godlike as much as you could. If there were such a being, that's probably something you should take pretty seriously. You should really want to know whether there is such a being, because it sounds like quite literally it would be the best possible being. And why would you ignore that? Like, of all the stuff that you're interested in, shouldn't you be interested in the good stuff? And if there is such a being as an infinitely perfect being, that would be the best being. And you better get your priorities straight and get right with God, if that is indeed the right way to define God. Another definition of God is, this might be kind of weird wording, but we're gonna see how this plugs into a famous argument for the existence of God. In particular, Anselm's classical argument known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. God is that which none greater can be conceived. So try to conceive of things. So what sorts of things can you think about? What sorts of things can you conceive? Can you conceive a 10-foot ice cream cone? Can you conceive of a bear that is able to ride a motorcycle backwards? Can you conceive of an airplane that can travel around the world 20 times without needing to be filled up? These are all things that you can conceive, and some of them are pretty cool things, like that airplane, and I mean, or even that bear. Like, those sound like pretty great. That'd be a pretty great airplane. Okay, now what is the greatest thing you can conceive? What is it? Whatever it is, by definition, there is nothing greater that you could conceive, because it is the greatest thing that you can conceive. So this definition of God is putting it in terms of what you can conceive, and saying that whatever God is that which is the greatest. And another way of stating that it's the greatest is that there's nothing else that is greater that you could conceive of. It is that which none greater can be conceived. You might say, like, oh, whatever, this is just a bunch of fancy talk. And maybe it's just a different way of putting this first definition, an infinitely perfect being. Yeah, but a lot of times wording matters. You get the wording in a particular way, and then you can make an argument get off the ground. Here's another definition of God, and maybe back when I asked you, how would you define God, you might have come up with this one. This is a pretty famous one. It's the one that we might call the one about the omnis. It's the one that defines God as omniscient, which is to say all-knowing. It's the one that defines God as also being omnipotent, which is to say all-powerful. Omnibenevolent, which is to say all-loving. And also, finally, the creator of the universe. We might say that everything that isn't God depends on God for its existence. So that's what it means to say that God is the creator of the universe. God is the source of everything that exists. And that right there leads into puzzles like, did God create himself or herself or itself? Is God self-created? You might say that sounds logically impossible for something to create itself. You might say that when it comes to causation, that we should embrace a general principle that nothing can come from nothing. And so if something created itself, then that means that first there was nothing, and then somehow it created itself. But wouldn't the thing have to exist first before it did anything? And so first it exists, and now that it's there to do something, it's going to make the first order of business to create itself. But wait a minute, it already existed, so it doesn't need to create itself. It just sounds weird. So maybe what it means for God to be the creator is that God, while everything else needed God to exist first, God always existed. So God never came into being. God was always in being. Everything else depends on God. God depends on nothing. God doesn't even depend on himself. He just is. Maybe. Anyway, so we've got 3 different definitions of God, and which definition we're going to be focusing on is going to depend on which argument we're discussing or critiquing or analyzing. Some of these are more important for some of the classic arguments than others. So, for example, that which none greater can be conceived, that's going to be really important for Anselm's argument, known as the ontological argument. An infinitely perfect being that has all and only perfections and has them to the infinite degree, that's going to be really important for Descartes' trademark argument. And both of those arguments we're going to discuss in this lecture. And then this argument is going to be, this definition is going to be really important for something we're going to discuss later, which is the argument from evil against the existence of God. And real quick, this definition would lead you, allegedly, to the belief that, well, if God was all loving, God wouldn't want anybody to have any suffering ever. You might say, like, look, part of what it is for you to be loving, you're like a little bit loving. You love some people, you love your neighbor, at least you love some of your neighbors, maybe you love some of your family members, and part of loving them means you don't want bad things to happen to them. Now, if you were all loving, you would have that attitude towards everybody. Every being that was capable of suffering is a being that you wouldn't want to suffer, and further, you wouldn't want them to have any suffering. So okay, all right. And if you're all powerful, you could do everything. And that means you could prevent the suffering. You could prevent there from being any suffering. And also, we could throw in the all knowing thing. If you were all knowing, then you would know about any suffering. And so you could swoop in and make it stop happening. In fact, you would know about future suffering, and then you would prevent it from having happened in the first place. And since you're the creator of the universe, plus all these other things, you would have created a universe in which there's no suffering, right? So, on this definition of God, if there is any suffering in the universe, it's supposed to follow then that there is no God. At least that's how the argument from evil against the existence of God is supposed to work. We'll get into that in a lot more detail in its own lecture about evil and atheism. Okay, so there's a summary of our three definitions of the existence of God. Let's move on and talk about how you might take one or more of these definitions and put them to work in some other areas of philosophy. And I'm going to focus on something from the history of the philosophy of physics. One of the things that physicists have been interested in are the nature of motion and space. These are topics that we've already discussed a little bit, or maybe even we discussed a lot in our earlier discussions in the metaphysics unit. We're talking about motion and whether motion is possible, the nature of space, whether space is infinitely divisible or not. And one debate in that ballpark is one that connects to physics, especially relativity theory, and that is whether the nature of space is something that is absolute as opposed to relational or relative. In the history of physics and also philosophical thinking about these topics, the view that space is relational is very closely associated with people like Galileo or Leibniz. And one way you might put their view is to say that according to them, space is constituted by relations between objects. All motion is relative motion. So if an object is moving, it only makes sense to say that that object is moving relative to other objects. It wouldn't make sense, according to the relationalists, to say that the object is moving relative to space itself. There's no such thing then as absolute space or absolute motion. We might put relationalism as the view that there's nothing to space above and beyond various relationships between objects. Hopefully this will get a little bit more clear as we get into some more examples. But let's talk about the opposite of relationalism, which is absolutism. And that's been represented historically by people like Isaac Newton, and maybe you've heard about Isaac Newton. He was another very famous physicist. Leibniz and Newton both get credit for inventing calculus. Newton, of course, had his famous laws of motion. He was very influential in the development of physics and our thinking about the way in which objects move and interact with each other and how gravity works, all that sort of stuff. So Newton and then also Clarke were famous absolutists. Their view about space is that space exists independently of the objects inhabiting it, and there are such things as absolute space and absolute motion. One way to put this is imagine that the universe has only one object in it, that all of space is empty except for one baseball. According to the absolutists, it would make sense for that baseball to be moving like 60 miles an hour. It's moving 60 miles an hour relative to space itself. That would be absolute motion. But according to the relationalists, that doesn't make any sense at all. If you had only one object, if you just had that baseball, it doesn't make sense to say that the baseball is moving. Now, if there was some other object, like there's the baseball and a baseball bat, well, they could be moving farther apart from one another, but it doesn't really matter which one you consider to be the one that's moving. You might say that the baseball is at the center of the universe and the baseball bat is moving away from it, or vice versa. The baseball bat is stationary and the baseball is moving, or that they're both moving. They're both moving away from each other. The relationalist says it doesn't matter. It's completely arbitrary which you consider to be moving and which you consider to be stationary, as long as you get the relations right. The absolutists say there's more to the relations. There's space itself, space considered independently of the objects in it. Some of you might have opinions about this. If I asked you, are you an absolutist or a relationalist? Some of you might say, well, you're a relationalist. You've thought about it a little bit and come to the conclusion that Leibniz and Galileo were right all along. And if you know about the history that comes after this, you know about Einstein, his famous relativity theory. And Einstein was largely a vindication of this old style relationalism, this old style relativity theory. Others might say, you know what, I don't care about Einstein or any of these guys. Absolutism seems to make the most sense. It makes sense to say that there could be just one thing, one baseball, and it's either moving or not. But here's another question. How would you decide between relationalism and absolutism? How would you know which one had the correct view? Is there any argument you could give that would establish a priori which one was correct and which one was in error? They can't both be right. Well, this brings us to the famous debate between Leibniz and Clarke. And they stated their debate in terms of what God could or couldn't do. So one way we might state the question that's that's up for grabs between the relationalist and the absolutist would be to ask, could God have made everything exactly 6 feet to the left of where it actually is? Could he have done that? Now you might say, well, here's a definition of God. God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, blah, blah, blah. But look, specifically at this part, God is all-powerful. God is omnipotent. Well, what does that mean? Doesn't that mean God can do everything? So you ask me, can God do it? It doesn't matter what you are asking about. He can do it. So can God lift 2 bulldozers over his head? Yes. Can God play 7 guitars at once? Yes. He can do everything. He can do it all. Well, could God make a 4-sided triangle? Oh, wait a minute. Whoa. Now, you might be tempted to say, like, yes, God can do everything, so he can make a 4-sided triangle. But other people might say, like, look, that's not a thing. There's no such thing as a 4-sided triangle. There couldn't be such a thing as a 4-sided triangle. So that's not it doesn't count against God if he can't do that. It's just not, there's nothing there. It would be like asking, can God if at the cat dog sandwich? Like, that's just nonsense. So it doesn't count against God that he doesn't if then at cat dog sandwich. You're not even saying anything meaningful when you string those words together. And similarly, you're not saying anything meaningful when you say 4-sided triangle. So there's just nothing there for God to be missing out on when he doesn't make such a thing. So what can God do when we say that God is all-powerful? Is that he's able to make actual, all logically possible situations. So, is God able to make everything have been exactly 6 feet to the left of where it actually is? Or in other words, is God able to move everything in the universe exactly 6 feet to the left? Like everything in the universe all at once, could it be moved 6 feet to the left? You might say this makes no sense at all. God could take any arbitrarily selected subset of the things in the universe and move them 6 feet to the left of the rest of the things. So he could like select a baseball, and relative to everything else in the universe, he can make that move 6 feet to the left. Or he could take the entire Rocky Mountain range or the Grand Canyon or the entire planet Earth and move it 6 feet to the left of everything else. He's just changing the relations between the objects. But to be moving all of the objects 6 feet to the left, that just doesn't make any sense at all. And this is the view that Leibniz had. Leibniz put it in terms of certain logical principles. So Clarke said, well, yeah, God is omnipotent. He's all powerful. So yes, he can move everything 6 feet to the left. But Leibniz says, no, that doesn't make any sense logically. And he invokes certain logical principles, at least one of which you've heard of already, because we talked about it when we were talking about personal identity theory, the problem of survival over time, and that is Leibniz law. Recall that Leibniz law is the logical principle saying that x and y are identical if x and y have all the same properties, and if x and y have any properties that are different from one another, then x and y are distinct. So if the tallest person in the class and the oldest person in the class have any different properties, like one of them's a redhead and the other one isn't, then they can't both be the same person. That's Leibniz law. And there's another thing that Leibniz is famous for, and that's his reliance on something known as the principle of sufficient reason. We might state the principle of sufficient reason for saying that everything that happens has to happen for a reason. So if God was able to make everything to 6 feet to the left, then there would have to be a difference between the universe the way it is and the universe that's 6 feet to the left. There would have to be some properties that the one had that the other one lacked in order for those to be two different versions of the universe. But there's no differences. Like if you were in the one universe versus the other, there's nothing that you could observe that would tell you which one you were in. There's nothing that you could observe that would tell you that you're in the one that was 6 feet to the left of where it was versus the other one. So then, according to Leibniz, those aren't really two different universes. So God couldn't make that difference because there's no difference there. A similar point is made by appealing to the principle of sufficient reason. For anything that happens, there has to be a reason for it to happen. And if we put this in terms of God's will, for anything that God does, he has to have some reason for doing that. For anything that he does, he has to have some reason for preferring it to be that way as opposed to some other way. But what is there in the going on if the universe is 6 feet to the left? If everything in the universe is 6 feet to the left, that really is no different from the way it was before. So there's really no basis for God to want it one way versus the other. So there's no reason that would be sufficient. God would have no reason for choosing the one situation over the other situation. So anyway, this is kind of a warm-up exercise to get you thinking about God and to see how different definitions of God and different aspects of those definitions work and how they can operate in various other areas of philosophy, like, for example, the philosophy of physics. Just to wrap up this debate, in case you still weren't quite getting what is at issue. Suppose instead of a universe with just one baseball in it, suppose there was a universe that had exactly two things in it and they were two spaceships. Would it be possible in a world with more than one entity, like, for example, a world with two spaceships in it, would it be possible that there's only one of these entities that is correctly regarded as motionless? The relationalist says no. You could pick any one of those and say that it is motionless. And the absolutist says, yeah, there has to be a right answer to which one, if any, is the motionless one. The spaceship over here says, you're moving, I'm the one that's stationary. The other spaceship says, no, you're moving, I'm the one that's stationary. And the relationalist says, they're both right. I mean, you could just choose either one. It's arbitrary. And the absolutist says, no, there has to be a right answer to which one is speaking truthfully. So on a relationalist view, if you wanted to, you could view the baby in this picture as being at the center of the universe. And instead of saying that these guys are throwing the baby in the water, we could say these guys are pushing the entire universe away from the baby. You could say that. Okay, part 4, Anselm's and Descartes' argument for the existence of God. So these are pretty famous arguments, and if you've never heard them before, you might find that they're really weird. When you first hear them, your reaction might be like, that is just the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, I can't believe people take this seriously. And I think a lot of philosophy is like that. When you're first exposed to it, you're like, wow, that's just crazy. And you're like, well, okay, well, what's wrong with it? And then you start to spell out what's wrong with it. And you come up with something completely different from what someone else thinks is wrong with it. And then you get into a big argument about which is the thing that is wrong with it. And then you realize, like, uh-oh, you are doing philosophy. You got sucked into it. um, so anyway, let's talk about Anselm's argument for the existence of God. Let's do it real fast and then go back over it more slowly. So here's his argument. Remember one of those definitions of God that we talked about? That's going to be the first premise of the argument. Premise one, God is that which none greater can be conceived. Now the second premise, the weirding might be weird. The wording might be weird to you, but we'll make sense of it as we go through it carefully. So the second premise says that a God that exists only in the understanding is not as great as a God that exists both in the understanding and in reality. So here's the idea. Think of something that is purely imaginary. So for example, a peanut butter sandwich that is bigger than a bus. That's something that you can think of. Now, in a sense, that exists only in your mind. It doesn't exist in reality. It merely exists in your mind, or as Anselm might put it, it exists in your understanding. You understand what it would be for there to be a peanut butter sandwich bigger than a bus, so it exists in your understanding. But in reality, in the world outside of your mind, there's lots of things bigger than buses. None of them are peanut butter sandwiches, however. There's just no peanut butter sandwich that's bigger than a bus. There's some pretty big peanut butter sandwiches out there, and I've eaten a lot of them, but none of them have been bigger than a bus. So that would be a thing that exists only in the understanding. But now imagine something that exists both in your understanding and in reality. So you know what a guitar is, and you're thinking about my guitar right now, and then you could see on the wall behind me that there actually is a guitar. And if you don't believe me, like I can, it sound good, right? Made some guitar noises. So now you might be convinced, like, yes, there really is a guitar in behind Mandic, and right. So on this day in the year 2018 in West Orange, New Jersey, there is a guitar. There exists in reality a guitar. So you not only understand what that is, but it also exists in reality outside of your mind. It exists both in your understanding and outside of your mind. Okay, now let's compare things and ask which is greater. So, what would be greater? A bowl of ice cream that exists only in your understanding, or a bowl of ice cream that exists both in your understanding and in real reality? By the way, I'm assuming you like ice cream, and maybe I shouldn't do that, but I love ice cream, and who doesn't? So if you ask me, hey Mandic, think about some ice cream, I would say, okay, I'm doing it. I'm thinking about some ice cream right now. And you're like, it's pretty good, right? Like, yeah, I enjoy thinking about some ice cream. And then they said, well, what would you rather do? Would you rather think about some ice cream, or would you rather, or instead, would you like to think about some ice cream while also eating some real ice cream? What would you rather do? In both cases, you're going to be thinking about it. In the case where you're eating the actual ice cream, you're not going to be doing it thoughtlessly. You're going to be thinking about ice cream while you're doing it, but you're also going to be eating actual ice cream. Which would be better? Situation A, where you're just thinking about the ice cream, or situation B, where in addition to thinking about the ice cream, you're also eating real ice cream? I think everybody who loves ice cream would also love situation B better than situation A. Okay, well, ice cream is pretty great, but what is something that is way greater than ice cream? What is something that, by definition, is the greatest possible thing? Well, look to premise one here, God. God is that which none greater can be conceived. Okay, now, what is better? A God that exists only in your mind, or a God that exists both in your mind and in actual reality? Well, and this is what the second premise is saying, a God that exists additionally to existing in your mind, also in actual reality, that would be better. that would be a better God. And given that, by definition, God is the greatest possible being, that's the God that exists. Another way of putting it is, by definition, God is the greatest. And if God didn't exist, God wouldn't be that great. That's not so great. I mean, like, there's a lot of great things that don't exist, but, like unicorns, they're pretty great. They don't exist, though. Santa Claus, well, he's pretty cool, but you know what? He doesn't exist. Um, Too bad for them. God, by definition, is the greatest. And if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be the greatest. So therefore, he exists. That's what's going on here with this argument. You might say, that can't be right. Even if you think that God exists, you might think that's a terrible argument. It can't be a good argument. What might be wrong with this argument? Besides, God doesn't exist. That's what an atheist would say. It's God doesn't exist, so you're not going to be able to prove that God exists. But that's kind of boring. That's not an interesting way to oppose this argument. It would be more interesting if, even though you thought God exists, you could point out some kind of flaw in the argument itself. There's a big difference between criticizing an argument and criticizing its conclusion. And it's really fun to grant that the conclusion is true and say that there's still something wrong with the argument. One very famous objection to the argument is one that comes from Immanuel Kant. And Kant says, well, the problem with the argument is that it's assuming that existence is a predicate. Or we might put it as it's assuming that existence is a property. But, says Kant, existence is not a property. So, what it means for something to be the greatest is it's got all the good properties. But existing is not a property. So therefore, it wouldn't follow from God's definition as having all the good properties that he would have existence, since existence is not a property. Another objection to the ontological argument of Anselm is one that comes from someone named Gaunilo, or Guanilo. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But anyways, he raised this objection, and he said he was raising it on behalf of the fool. And he said, look, you could use the same sort of reasoning to prove that a perfect island exists. Well, how would you do that? Well, let's define the perfect island as that island than which none greater island could be conceived. Now, suppose, this perfect island is one in which it's impossible for anyone to get sick while they're on the island. It's also impossible for anyone to run out of money when they're on the island. It's also impossible for anyone to stub their toe while they're on the island. It's also impossible for the island to get crowded no matter how many people want to go there. So think of all the ways in which an island could be really, really awesome. This island has it all because it's, by definition, the greatest conceivable island. Now, what would be better? An infinitely perfect island that exists only in your mind, or one that also exists in real reality? You might say, well, I want to go to the one that exists in real reality. I don't want to just think about it. I want to be there doing it. So it would seem to follow then that it exists. But you may have seen some islands in your day. You may have even lived on an island, and you might be pretty confident that this island we're talking about doesn't exist. So there has to then therefore be something wrong with the argument for the existence of God. So what do we got so far? We've got this famous argument, Anselm's ontological argument, and we've raised two objections to it. One of them comes from Kant, and that says that existence is not a predicate, and the other one comes from Gaunilo, and it's the perfect island objection, the objection on behalf of the fool. Let's move to another argument for the existence of God. This one comes from Descartes, and this comes out of Descartes' discussion that you should be familiar with from our epistemology unit when we were talking about Descartes' criticisms of empiricism and the rationalism that he was trying to develop using his method of doubt. And this involves also all sorts of stuff, like the whole thing about I think, therefore I am, and the deceitful demon. So let's go back to that. Descartes, recall, is trying to see if he can prove the existence of anything, to see if he can prove that there's something that would be solid knowledge upon which he could build other knowledge and have like a full developed science that has like a solid foundation. So he's looking for solid foundational beliefs, beliefs that he couldn't doubt. And he discovered like that he had this one belief, the belief that I think, and that led to this other belief, the belief that I exist, I think, therefore I exist. And he was trying to see if he could prove anything else. And he's like, well, I could prove that I'm a thinking thing. If I think and I exist, it follows that the sort of thing I am is a thinking thing. Okay, well, what else do you got, Descartes? Right now, at this stage of the argument, Descartes hasn't yet proven anything besides his own mind. There doesn't exist yet in this argument anything that is distinct from God. I'm sorry, whoops. Anything distinct from Descartes. I just kind of gave away the punchline of a joke, but you'll see in a little bit. So Descartes is trying to see if he could prove the existence of something besides Descartes' own mind. And he comes up with, he realizes he's got inside of him a bunch of ideas, like the idea of asparagus, and the idea of broccoli, and the idea of an umbrella, and the idea of a guitar. And for each of those ideas, that doesn't prove that those things exist in reality. Like, for all he knows, he invented those ideas and then just forgot about it. Like, he just made up the idea of a guitar, but there's no actual guitar that caused him to have that idea. But what about the idea of God? Isn't the idea of God like so super duper awesome that the only thing that could have been the source of the idea of God is God himself? Now, Descartes puts that together in this argument, which gets called the trademark argument, because the idea is something like that you discover the idea of God in yourself, and that's like the trademark of the creator. Just like someone who makes like a silver candlestick might put their name on it, and that is their trademark. So God, the creator of you, left his mark on you, and you can discover within yourself the idea of God, and that leads you to the creator, the way a signature might lead you to the painter. So we could put the argument like this. I have the idea of an infinitely perfect being. Second premise, cause must be greater than its effect. Third premise, the only thing greater than the idea of an infinitely perfect being is an actually existing infinitely perfect being. Therefore, God exists. Now, at this point, you might say, wait a minute. Okay, so Descartes has proven the existence of God, but has he proven the existence of anything outside of himself? Like, maybe Descartes is God, and he hasn't. Like, well, that'd be nice to prove that you're God, but like, if you're trying to prove the existence of the external world, simply proving that God exists doesn't do it. Why? Because for all you know, you are God. And so just by proving that God exists doesn't get you anything more than what you had when you proved I exist from I think. So how does Descartes know that he's not God? That's a really important question he needs to have an answer to make further progress on his epistemological project. And he does have a pretty good answer to that question. How does he know he isn't God? Well, he says, I have doubts. I'm able to doubt things. I'm able to doubt whether the external world exists. But God wouldn't have any doubts. For any proposition, God knows whether it's true or not. There's nothing where he's like, could be true, could be false, I don't know. So Descartes has doubts, and therefore, just by having doubts, is able to know that he himself is not God. And so therefore, it follows, according to this argument, plus the other arguments that came before it in Descartes, he has proven the existence of something external to himself, namely God. And then he argues further, by the way, if you're interested in this sort of thing, that the rest of the external world probably exists pretty much the way that he perceives it, because God, being the creator of Descartes, and also being a pretty good guy, wouldn't have created Descartes to be massively deceived about what his senses tell him. So that's how he's supposed to know that the external world exists. But anyways, our interest here is just about the God stuff, so we're mostly just interested in this lecture about what Descartes' trademark argument is for the existence of God. Now, you might wonder if there's any objections to Descartes' argument, and there's some obvious ones. Like one of the objections is like, where did premise 2 come from? A cause must be greater than its effect. Is that really true? Like, couldn't you have like a really small machine that is able to destroy a very large object? Uh, isn't that possible? Um, why must the cause be greater than its effect? How does he know that's supposed to be true? Or how about this one? The only thing greater than the idea of an infinitely perfect being is an actually existing infinitely perfect being. Um, how does he know that that's true? Uh, that seems dubious. He might doubt those various premises and therefore cast doubt on Descartes' argument uh, for the existence of God. Okay, so we could go on about this stuff for hours and hours and hours and hours, but I propose that we don't. And let's wrap it up with some study questions. Okay, study question time. Questions for you to study. Study question number 1. By the way, Anselm is short for Saint Anselm, which is short for Saint Anselm of Canterbury. And you don't, it's not super important to me that you know the full names of these characters, but you might be interested. So, Saint Anselm of Canterbury argued that A, the concept of the lost island is that of the most perfect island imaginable. B, a purely imaginary God is more perfect than a real God. C, a real God is more perfect than an imaginary God. D, the concept of God is that of the most perfect being imaginable. E, both C and D. Study question 2. One objection to the ontological argument that Gounod raised on behalf of the fool is that A, pure reason alone could never prove God's existence. B, the reasoning of the ontological argument apparently proves the existence of a perfect lost island just as well as it proves the existence of God. C, we should believe in God on faith alone. D, the existence of God is unprovable. E, the ontological argument is not in the Bible. So we just have 2 study questions today, and here are the answers. The answer to study question number 1 is E, and the answer to study question 2 is B. And until next time, this is Dr. Pete Manick saying, I'll talk to you later. That's what I'm saying. Goodbye.